This video was chosen for production by my subscribers on Patreon. If you'd like to help pick the next one, the link is in the description. Hello everyone. Thanks for the great response to my last video. It took a couple of weeks extra to come out due to illness, but I hope it was worth the wait. The video this week will be a bit of an explainer for that video. I'm going to work through each book in turn and go through some of the choices and why I made them. I'll be keeping account of the new characters and railway lines I introduced as we go, which I'll explain afterwards. I know my videos aren't the most slick productions, and this one will be a bit more of a general chat about each book until towards the end, with no real firm script. There will also be a bit of news about the next research video at the end, so stick around for that. If you haven't seen the video in question, it's probably a good idea to check that out first, otherwise this won't make too much sense. The link is in the description. Okay, so the first book I proposed was Really Useful Engines. I chose to base the first story around Elsie, as she has been a character on Wilbert's model for years, and made a brief appearance in the surprise packet. Old King Cole, named after the nursery rhyme, is another long-standing model. I chose this truck over the others on the layout, as I thought it had a better name than Sodor Oils, City of Emneth Gas, Sun Coal, those ones. James and Edward getting the next two stories made sense to me, as they had mostly been relegated to background roles in the Railway series books for some years. James shows some great growth and the changing nature of the railway here, with him taking the goods, and the twins, despite still being jokers at heart, show their useful side too. This book introduced two new standard gauge rolling stock characters. Next up is diesel engines. I got a few comments on about this book suggesting that Wilbert never grew to love diesel engines. I'd probably agree with this, but characters like Rusty and Boko are almost always shown in a good light, and I think this book would come along late enough to show how some diesels were useful machines, withdrawn before their time, and maybe worth saving. I've always been keen to see Mavis travel down Thomas's branch line, with permission of course, and having her team up with Daisy seemed a great pairing. We never see Mavis meet Boko or Bear either, so it would be great to finally have them meet. Introducing Brian the Ferry was an instance of taking lore from the Island of Sodor book and applying it to my proposed books. Having the worn out old machine being cantankerous rather than sad as we often see in the main series, it also makes Bear seem more sympathetic, further making a side with the diesels. The next two stories feature a diesel whose crew conspire to save them from scrap by getting them on an express service to Sodor and then refusing to leave, as going back will mean scrap for their engine. This is the only major character I included who is wholly made up. I chose a class 52 because of the year the book is set. Many good candidates had already been withdrawn by this time. I chose Western Explorer, to have their name affectionately shortened to Laura to be a good candidate. Their rescue would prompt the Fat Controller to consider rescuing more diesels. Diesel Engines introduces a new standard gauge engine and a non-rail character. Small Diesel Engines is the next book. I avoided any mention of Jock and Frank, as that would have messed with an already scruffy timeline for the two small railway books. I may make a video about them in future. Anyway, I did get to include Sigrid and the Blisters, as well as the Bobo Diesel mentioned in the lectures. The first story introduces us to the Blister twins, two helpful but impetuous little engines who enjoy bothering Mike, along with seemingly every other engine on the line. The next establishes the Bobo Diesel as returning to the line with a stronger engine due to their rebuild at Craven's Gate. I named them Ormsted as their basis was also named after a pub, and this is the name of a local one. They are unaware of Sigrid being built, and think that they have returned in time to take over Bert's duties as he is getting his rebuild. The introduction of Sigrid then is an unpleasant surprise to them. The next two stories would show the rivalry between these two engines and their eventual friendship. While Sigrid is a confirmed character in the Island of Sodor book, the Bobo has not appeared. It is possible that they were cut from the Loco roster, however the book also doesn't include Frank, who we know was on the line by the time of publication. I chose to include them here. This book introduces 4 new small gauge engines. Next up is Bloomer's book. This book explores Bloomer's history and future on the line, with Edward being a great engine for him to be paired up with, both being very experienced engines. The first story tells about Bloom's discovery by the Fat Controller, and the second discusses how steam enthusiasts view engines in non-prototypical liveries through the lens of a man Bloomer remembers from the old days. This would be important as Bloomer's red livery is not one he would have worn in service. Bloomer's special introduces two new observation coaches which were hauled on enthusiast trains on Wilbert's model railway. I chose to name them Rose and Gale. The wildlife sanctuary at Elsbridge is another feature from the Island of Sodor book. The last story hints towards Sir Topham Hatt's collection of preserved engines. It is not clear if these are separate from the engines who work on the North Western Railway or a private collection. Either way, it is a small piece of evidence that Sodor could have some more unusual engines than expected. This book has a new standard gauge engine and two new standard gauge rolling stock characters, as well as a visiting character. Next up is the book about the Skarloey Railway, Diligent Little Engines. It would have been 12 years since this line's last major entry into the series, and a lot has changed. Duke meeting Bloomer I thought was a great way to show Wilbert introducing two engines found in sheds late on in his writing career, but it is also good for showing the developments the line had been going through in that time. The crossing story also comes from the Island of Sodor lore, but the minor bus character is my own invention. I considered basing them on the bus on Wilbert's layout, but thought it too similar to Bulgy. The Charabang is an Awdry character though, coming straight from the lectures. I love the idea of the open coaches next to the open Charabang's deck. I named the fourth coach who appears in the surprise packet Teresa, as Ada, Jane and Mabel's names are in alphabetical order and get a letter longer each time, so it fit the pattern. The last story shows Duke being put to work on his first trains on the Skarloey, and he is given the use of two coaches rebuilt from mid-Sodor coaches to work with. Some of these are mentioned in the Island of Sodor book. I chose to call them Joan and Alma. This book introduces 5 new narrow gauge rolling stock characters and 2 non-rail characters. The next book is Squat Little Engines and focuses mostly on the unseen Sodor and Mainland Railway. The flashback device is begun by Rennius and Skarloey talking about the haulage wagon mentioned in the lectures. We then move to the past and get a story with each of the 3 Sodor and Mainland engines. I named the other 2 Walter and Mitchell after the manufacturers, Walter Nielsen and James Mitchell. The slate crashing over the main line and Neil's sale to the Cravensgate Mining Company are details taken from the lectures and the Island of Sodor book. This book includes 2 new standard gauge engines and a whole new line. The next book is Goods Engines. This book features a lot of lore from the Island of Sodor book, such as the uranium mines at Tory Wreck and the granite works. A major thing this book sets up is the eventual rescue of Barry. Even though that character is a Christopher Awdry creation, it means there is more freedom to rescue engines from scrap lines to help with the goods work on the island, which is far healthier than that on the mainland. A visiting engine is introduced here. Electric Engines is the book I wrote no story outlines for. I thought it was too much to introduce a whole line's worth of history and characters when we know so little about them. I would really like to make a video looking at the possible rolling stock of the electric railway though. One electric engine at least would be included in this book, as well as the line they run on. The penultimate book is Bygone Little Engines. This book shows characters from Wilbert's other model railway, the Ulfstead Road layout. The horse and cart and parliamentary trains are mentioned in the layout notes, and would be named services on the mid-Sodor, like the picnic and boat trains. The locked doors of the coaches is a feature described in the Island of Sodor, as is the Isle of Man steamer. Lastly, I thought it would be fun to see Stanley before the accident. I have a few mid-Sodor theories I want to make future videos about too. 4 new narrow gauge engines are introduced in this book. The last book is the old branch line engines. Like the real final book, Tramway Engines, this book takes place on Thomas's branch line. The Fat Controller and Thomas are the heart and soul of this book. The Tidmouth, Knapford and Elsbridge light railway history is told in brief here, through the stories of the 3 coffee pot engines, much as the Sodor and Mainland was in Squat Little Engines. I chose this line over the Wellsworth and Sudbury, as the coffee pots get a mention in the surprise packet. The last story would show the beginning of Annie and Clarabelle's relationship with Thomas. Fitting, I think, as Annie was the first character ever made, her model dating back from the 1920s. 3 new standard gauge characters are introduced in this book, as well as their branch line. I got some comments saying that Wilbert was done with writing the books by the point of Tramway Engines, and he didn't want to write anymore. Of course, I agree with this, but this video was to explore an alternative universe where he did still want to keep writing. I used as much of his own material to shape the books around them, and combining that with some stats, I was able to predict characters and locations that would appear. Over the course of his 26 Railway Series volumes, Wilbert introduced 8 major railway lines, 19 standard gauge and 19 smaller gauge engines, 10 standard gauge and 13 smaller gauge rolling stock characters, 7 non-rail vehicles, and 9 visiting engines. Using these numbers over a 26 book run, we can find out how many of each category would roughly be included in the next 10 books. Therefore, I was aiming to add 3 to 4 major railway lines, 7 to 8 standard gauge and smaller gauge engines, 3 to 4 standard gauge and 5 smaller gauge rolling stock characters, 2 to 3 non-rail vehicles, and 3 to 4 visitors. Apart from the electric engines, where I am not sure how many of these would be introduced, I managed to get all these figures right. Obviously, these calculations are just for fun, but I think they roughly hold up. One last thing I forgot to mention is that as well as a new title, Christopher Awdry's books would need to be renumbered, with the 27th book Really Useful Engines being retitled Helpful Engines and renumbered 37. This new numbering would continue throughout his books. I think I may have to do a video soon with books he could have written if he carried on writing between New Little Engine and Thomas and Victoria. Anyway, thanks for watching everyone, and if you have any further questions, just ask below. And now a little bit of news about my next research video. I've put up a poll to decide who the next research video should be about on Patreon, so feel free to check that out. I'm hoping to have this research finished soon and up by summer. I have to admit I'm excited about returning to the research videos. Thanks very much and hope to see you again. Thanks for watching everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to the Patreon like these fine folk to help pick the next video subject, get early access to new content and help support the channel.